a billionaire had everything: power, wealth, and respect. But the day his wife gave birth to a baby girl, he made a decision that would haunt him for the next 20 years. He rejected his own daughter and drove her and her mother out into the streets with nothing. They struggled through poverty while he built an empire, but fate had a different plan. 2 decades later, the little girl he abandoned returned, not as a victim, but as one of the most powerful businesswomen in Africa. What happened next brought the mighty billionaire to his knees, begging for the forgiveness he never thought he'd need. Stay until the end, because this unforgettable story proves that success is the greatest revenge, and forgiveness is the greatest victory. The city of Lagos never slept. Glittering skyscrapers reflected the morning sun, and among them stood the headquarters of Morrison Group, one of the largest companies in Africa. At the top floor, behind glass walls and expensive furniture, sat billionaire Richard Morrison. He was feared by his competitors and respected by politicians. Newspapers called him the king of business, but behind all his wealth was a heart that had become cold over the years. Richard had one rule: family must never become a weakness. 20 years earlier, his wife Grace gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Richard had hoped for a son to inherit his business empire. When the doctor announced it was a girl, disappointment filled his face. Grace smiled as she held their newborn. "She's perfect," she whispered. But Richard turned away. "I don't need a daughter," he said coldly. Grace couldn't believe her ears. "She's your child." Richard looked at the baby without emotion. "I will not let a girl inherit everything I built." From that day he barely acknowledged his daughter. Grace named her Amara, meaning grace. For 5 years Grace tried to keep the family together. She hoped Richard's heart would soften. It never did. One rainy evening, Grace packed a small suitcase. Holding Amara's tiny hand, she stood at the mansion's gate. Richard watched from the balcony. "If you leave," he shouted, "don't ever come back." Grace looked up with tears in her eyes. "One day you'll regret rejecting your own child." Without another word, she disappeared into the storm. Life became difficult. Grace worked as a cleaner during the day and sold homemade food at night. Money was scarce. Some nights they shared one loaf of bread. But Grace never complained. Instead, she told Amara every evening, "Your value isn't determined by someone who refuses to see it." Amara grew into a kind and intelligent girl. She studied under streetlights when electricity failed. She borrowed books from the public library because they couldn't afford textbooks. Her classmates laughed at her worn-out shoes. She simply smiled and kept studying. Years passed. At 16, Amara earned a scholarship to one of the country's best universities. Grace cried with joy. "My daughter," she whispered, "you're proving everyone wrong." Amara graduated as the best student in engineering. Soon after, an international technology company offered her a job overseas. She accepted. For the next 10 years, Amara worked harder than anyone. She invented affordable renewable energy systems for rural communities. Her innovations transformed thousands of lives. Investors noticed. Governments partnered with her. Eventually, she founded Lumina Technologies, a company dedicated to solving Africa's energy challenges. Within a decade, it became one of the continent's fastest-growing businesses. Ironically, Lumina Technologies began competing directly with Morrison Group. Richard had no idea who owned the company threatening his empire. Meanwhile, age caught up with Richard. His trusted executives betrayed him. A financial scandal shook Morrison Group. Investors pulled out. Banks demanded repayment of massive loans. Within months, billions disappeared. Richard's empire began collapsing. The once powerful billionaire found himself sitting alone in his office. The phones stopped ringing. The visitors disappeared. Even distant relatives avoided him. For the first time in decades, Richard was afraid. One afternoon, his lawyer entered quietly. "Sir, there's only one company willing to buy Morrison Group and save thousands of employees." Richard sighed. "Who?" Lumina Technologies. Richard nodded. Arrange the meeting. The conference room was silent. Richard waited. The doors opened. A confident woman in an elegant navy blue suit walked inside. She carried herself with quiet dignity. Behind her followed lawyers and executives. Richard stood to greet her. Then he froze. Those eyes. That smiled. She looked exactly like Grace. The woman extended her hand. Good afternoon, Mr. Morrison. My name is Amara. The room suddenly felt smaller. Richard's hands trembled. Amara. She nodded calmly. Yes. His voice cracked. My daughter. Silence. For 20 years he had never spoken that word. Amara looked directly into his eyes. I've always been your daughter. You simply chose not to be my father. Every executive in the room exchanged shocked glances. Richard couldn't speak. The meeting continued. Amara reviewed the company's finances with professionalism. She offered to purchase Morrison Group, not to destroy it, but to protect the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on it. Richard finally asked, Why would you help me after everything I did? Amara answered softly, Because innocent families shouldn't suffer for one man's mistakes. Her words pierced his heart. That evening, Richard drove to the small neighborhood where Grace still lived. The luxurious cars that once followed him were gone. He walked alone. Grace opened the door. Time had added silver to her hair, but her gentle smile remained. Richard fell to his knees. I'm sorry. Tears rolled down his face. I was proud, selfish, blind. I rejected the greatest blessing God ever gave me. Grace remained silent. Then she simply said, You don't owe me an apology. You owe one to your daughter. The next morning, Richard visited Lumina Technologies. This time there were no lawyers, no contracts, no reporters, only a father and the daughter he had lost. He stood outside Amara's office for several minutes before knocking. Come in. He entered slowly. I don't deserve forgiveness. No, you don't, Amara replied honestly. Richard lowered his head. I can't change the past. I know, but if you'll allow me, I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to become the father I should have been. Amara stared through the window. Years of pain filled her heart. The birthdays he missed. The school graduations. The nights she cried wondering why her father didn't love her. Nothing could erase those memories. Finally she spoke. I forgive you. Richard looked up in disbelief. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You missed 20 years. We can never get them back. Richard nodded with tears in his eyes. I understand. Over the following years, Richard slowly rebuilt relationships instead of businesses. He attended charity events with Amara. Together they created scholarships for children abandoned by their parents. They funded hospitals and schools. Richard often shared his story publicly. I once believed wealth was the greatest legacy, he admitted. I was wrong. The greatest legacy is the people you choose to love. When Richard passed away years later, his funeral wasn't remembered because he had once been one of Africa's richest men. It was remembered because his daughter stood before thousands and said, My father made terrible mistakes. But before he left this world, he found the courage to admit them. That courage changed both of us. The crowd applauded through tears. Amara looked toward the sky and smiled. Her mother's words echoed in her heart. Your value isn't determined by someone who refuses to see it. She had carried those words all her life. And in the end, they had changed not only her destiny, but also the heart of the man who once rejected her.